everyone. Welcome. We are delighted and excited to introduce our dear friend Pierre Michel Henry. Pierre may often be dressed fully in black, but he is indeed a colorful character. He is, amongst many things, a chess prodigy,
a master chef,
a talented singer,
a keen interest in art,
an avid student of medieval history,
a multilingual impersonator.
As a schoolboy, he raised money for Broadway shows.
He went to both Oxford and Cambridge.
His legs and torso exist solely to transport his biceps.
And Pierre is also a non-conformist. As an international entrepreneur, he's never really had a real desk job with fixed hours, a boss, an office. And so you can imagine what it was like for him to discover the joys of freedom at JP Morgan last summer. And he and I talked a lot throughout the summer, and he'd call me and sometimes be really happy about having the opportunity to work for such a great institution in such a great structured environment. And at other times he'd be like, this is terrible, I hate corporate America, never again. And I was kind of scared he would somehow reveal that latter part to the rest of his team. But he never did for the entire 10 weeks. Or so I thought. On his last day at the company, at a very important time when decisions are actually made about full-time offers, he strolled into his MD's office unannounced and said in a very Pierre manner, I've been watching you, and I don't really like the way you treat your staff, so even if I got a full-time offer from JP Morgan, don't waste your time. I would never accept it anyway.
Despite that, Pierre is actually an incredible sweet talker, and I can say from experience that this comes in handy in a crisis. So we were supposed to live together this year, and so we leased an apartment in Palo Alto. Then he got into Schwab, I got into Highland, so we decided, let's Airbnb the apartment. Amazing idea. We were going to make so much money rolling in dollar, right? From the start of fall quarter, our level of incompetence was startling. We were losing money, we were rushing back and forth between classes to the apartment to prepare it for new guests. And then we really hit rock bottom. So we had this family of 6 in the apartment for 10 days, okay? And we had a 3-hour turnaround until this Russian couple arrived. So easy, we hire a cleaner, Susan, right? So D-Day arrives and Susan is missing in action. No show, no response, like a shit show. So as VP of operations, I rushed to the apartment and opened the door, and it was sickening, like apocalyptic. There was mold growing in the fridge. There was congealed animal fat clogging the sink. There was blood on the sheets. There were clumps of hair all over the bathroom, not making any of us up. There was all this weird fluff all over the floor, like a Rottweiler had murdered a duck. And the vacuum cleaner wasn't working. So I just went for it on all fours, picking up bits of hair and fluff with my hands, washing bloody sheets. My American dream Stanford MBA is being swamped in a cocktail of dishwashing liquid, bleach, and bodily fluids. After 2 hours of this, Pierre arrives, and His Highness sweeps into the apartment, impeccably dressed, as always, tassels on his shoes, bouncing, scarf flowing behind him. And he took one look at this public health hazard that was the apartment, and he took charge. He told me to leave because I'd scare the guests. And from then on, all I know is the following. The Russian couple arrived. They were furious. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, they were aneurysm level furious. Okay? And all I know is that they stayed. Not only that, they paid full price, no discount, and they did not leave a negative review. This guy is a magician. If he was O.J. Simpson, people would actually believe he was innocent.
Finally, Pierre loves traditions, like the Cambridge Mabel, or his workout routine. But he's particularly weird about one specific routine, and that's his spa routine. See, Pierre and I have developed a tradition of going to spas wherever we travel. We've even gone to spas with some of you. And he always does the same thing, whether it's with me, you guys, other friends, or this Russian model named Svetlana in St. Petersburg. First, Pierre gets naked. Second, he goes into the steam room, then the sauna, and the hot tub. But one thing he does particularly well is Pierre always finishes off in the shower. Please help us welcome Pierre.
All right. You never get a second chance at a first impression. And it turns out that first impressions are not my strong suit. In fact, they've often been most uncharitable to me in setting the wrong tone for who I am as a person. It was the night of June 12th, 2013, and I was extremely nervous. I was due to give a speech in Mandarin celebrating a partnership between Sony Pictures and the Chinese government. I had never given a speech in Mandarin before, much less to 1,000 Communist Politburo members from one of the largest auditoriums I had ever been in. It was fine, though, because I knew the speech by heart. I had practiced it hundreds of times. I even had the paper in front of me. What could go wrong? Well, my name, for starters. This is my Chinese name. It is pronounced Pierre Hung Li. It's a simple transliteration, and as many of you know, Chinese is a tonal language. There are 4 tones up on the screen. In isolation, they're very easy to say, but in a complex string of sentences, they are damnable details to master. But I had been living in China for 2 years. I knew my name. Or so I thought. You see, I want to focus on one particular character, the P here. This is a second rising tone, P. Not very hard to say, but it turns out in Mandarin there is another character that uses the same word. This P is pronounced with the 4th tone, P. It's a falling tone. It means fart. In fact, this is the root word for the rectum in Chinese, all of its constituent parts. So we have pigu, meaning ass. We have pian, meaning anal orifice. We have pijing, meaning ass fairy. And my personal favorite curse, jiani sheng pei zi mei pigu yan, meaning may your child be born with an imperforate. Guys, I really can't emphasize enough how important it is to get the tone right. Well, I was a little too excited at the time, and I launched onto the stage and announced with great enthusiasm that I, Mr. Anal Orifice, was delighted to introduce you. The laughter took a good minute to die down. Fortunately, the rest of the presentation went well, but I was referred throughout the Q&A as the big hole. So you see, first impressions and I are strange bedfellows. The same thing was true here at the GSB. Throughout most of my first year here, everyone thought I was an international student, even though I was born in New York City and I grew up there my entire childhood. And there were some pretty comical attributions and misattributions to this. For example, throughout most of my first year, most of my section members kept congratulating me on my American accent and the incredible fluency Artel and Schwab repeatedly solicited me for Romance language lessons throughout most of the first year, which was bizarre. And in week 1, I was added to the international WhatsApp thread and was constantly solicited for advice on how to navigate the treacherous H-1B visa process. Well, as I was writing this talk, it occurred to me that my bizarre relationship with first impressions actually traces back to childhood. Looking back at photos at the time, I'm kind of amazed I had any friends. I want to start with dress. You see, my mother insisted that I appear every day dressed as a sailor. I also went through most of childhood with a permanent frown on my face. I like to call this my resting bitch face. And this caused a lot of problems for me also. As fellow New Yorkers in the room will know, getting into kindergarten in Manhattan is almost as challenging as getting into the GSB. ERB exams start when one is 4 years old. I didn't really respond very well to this, to much external stimuli. I usually look like that in interview. Most of the proctors found me standoffish, even a little disturbed. They told my parents that I was likely autistic. There was one particular test, very simple. It involved a human head and a torso. The testee simply had to complete the drawing by finishing the missing limbs. Apparently, I took the pencil, stared like the girls in The Shining for a good 30 seconds. Put in a belly button. Pocketed the pencil. I can only hope that my 4-year-old self assumed that this person might be paraplegic. The proctor was not as open-minded, and she informed my parents that I was likely sociopathic. I must have flunked out of every admissions test in Manhattan. Well, some photos of my family. My dad and my grandfather have always encouraged my French side. And my father is an entrepreneur and always traveled when I was a kid, and I barely ever got to see him. And so I tried everything in the book to try to show him how much I missed him. I realized that the best way to connect with my dad was through mathematics and puzzles. Cool. And so when I was 6 years old, this developed into an obsession with competitive chess tournaments. By 9, I was being trained by grandmasters, and it was bizarre. They used to blindfold me, and we would play without the board and the pieces, and they would see how long I could go from memory. So I got good at this, and by the time I was 12, I was nationally ranked on the circuit. At 14, I started to win some prize money, and by 15, I made it as far as number 2 in the US in the junior category. The problem is that I never cared about the ranking or the prize money. I just really wanted my dad to be proud of me. I still do. This is my mom. She's a painter, and the best way to summarize her for you is a memory. When I was 10 years old, I remember going right up to one of these types of paintings hanging in our home, and because my mother is an abstract expressionist, there's never a clear representation of the subject matter in any of her works, so it's confusing. So I said, Mom, there's this explosion of color in this painting. I love it. I've been drawn to it for weeks. I don't know what it is. Can you just tell me, like, what is this? And without a moment's delay, she said, it's my uterus. So no topics were ever off limits with Mom. And being Swedish, I ate meals growing up that I think most Americans would find a little weird. I usually had raw fish every morning before school, herring, gravlax, that kind of thing, with black coffee. Because my mother had a strong Scandinavian side, she also encouraged a real love of animals and nature, and especially compassion. I grew up with an uncle who is mentally disabled, who lived with us, and he's going to be important in the story later. I think my parents taught me to appreciate math and art as two sides of the same coin. But mainly they were desperate just to find an outlet for me to take myself a little less seriously. The good news is I finally found it in the theater in high school, specifically acting, writing, singing. First impressions of me on stage were never awkward or regrettable. And I found myself taking huge risks that I never did before. I became willfully imaginative. I fell in love with language and its power and presentation. I started to wear a lot of black, and it hasn't changed to this day. I also have to confess I enjoyed all of the sexual attention I started to receive from girls when we were forced to rehearse a lot of romance scenes on the stage. Theater really was for me the key catalyst to encourage me to go into entertainment long-term professionally. However, my success sexually in the theater did not reproduce itself outside of the theater, unfortunately. There, I had the same problems with first impressions I always had. And yes, I'm going to go there. My early sexual experiences were extremely awkward. The truth is that I was 16 and had no idea what I was doing. Well, The first woman I ever got naked with was called Lucy. And the truth is that I was so excited, and this is really embarrassing, but I was just so excited. And I had this bottle of lube. And I squeezed it just a little too hard, and I sprayed Lucy in the face with it. And so I panicked, and I tried to clean it up, and I ended up squeezing the bottle again, spilling more lube on the floor, and then I slipped over. That was our last date. Then there was Elaine. And Elaine had a very playful side, and she wanted to role play the first time we had sex. And I was like, this I can do. This theater has prepared me for. And so she came in dressed as a slutty doctor. And she asked if I, the patient, was ready to begin the examination. Now, in retrospect, the correct answer to the question was, the pain is down here, doctor. Or something to that effect. Instead, as usual, I panicked. My ingenious response, I said, shouldn't we fill out some paperwork? Panicking and flinging around. Then there was Holly. Holly lived on the second floor of a walk-up on the Upper West Side of New York City, and it's very, very important that you realize that if the window was open, people on the street level could hear you. I didn't know this. And I was just so excited during sex, which, we actually got there, which was a record for me. And I was so excited that I actually went into the high-pitched falsetto range of my singing voice to express my pleasure. 2 moments later, a big man on the street yelled out, "You sound good, girl! Get some for me, too!" Alright, well, thankfully things got better for me at university. The transition, going to Cambridge and living in England really was one of the very happiest times in my life. Imagine a medieval city with dreaming spires, turrets, cathedrals, where the keeping of the hours are kept by the college clock towers. And all around you, people are dressed in black tie at magical hours of the night. The cobbled streets capture the smell of chestnut in spring and the resonance of the laughter of all the students who pass. For me, this was like a dream come true, and I speak so nostalgically about it because at Cambridge I met a very important person. This is Rosemary, and I will never forget my first impression of her. She wore a white dress kissed with oleander flowers, and she had this incredible dulcet voice that landed on others with a lot of gentleness, but also a kind of authority, which I admired. She had this smile that seemed to focus on you and only you with total focus, and it was just amazing. And to me, she had a kind of beauty that, frankly, was dignified by the fact that she behaved very humbly and dressed very simply, unlike me. I used to think, because everyone stared at Rosemary, that she had a kind of luster on her skin, left behind by all of her admirers who stared at her throughout the course of her life. And I found myself getting more and more attracted to this person. And I came to realize that her personality was a lot like champagne on Christmas morning. That's how I think of it. It was incredibly refined and educated, but spontaneous, fun, generous, intoxicating. She could be also, in her way, extremely English, maybe even tragically so. A little like the characters on Downton Abbey. But if you look past her shyness and her stoicism, the qualities that were hardest to see were also the ones that made her perfect to me. She was very disciplined, and she had incredible achievements in sport and in the legal profession. And I saw in her discipline an incredible capacity to give all her energy to something that she loved. And I fell in love with that too. It's strange because no one else saw the same qualities in her that I did. And I used to think in a weird way that it was like she was singing a song only I could hear. And I found myself body and mind in harmony with her. Luckily for me, she also found me equally attractive. And I remember it was one of the few times in my life where the first impression I gave was a really, really good one. And so we started one of those white phosphorus hot romances where you're terrified to fall asleep at night because reality is finally better than your wildest dreams. Home, for me, was a person all of a sudden, not a place. And throughout all our adventures together in later years, I found myself becoming a better friend, partner, and man. She encouraged me as I started my career in international entrepreneurship. I chose China because incredible tectonic shifts were happening in entertainment, and I wanted to be a part of it. I thought any expat brave enough to go out there could do really well. And so I want to now shift and talk a little bit more about that. My early days in China were laughably difficult. The learning curve was more like a wall I repeatedly slammed my thick head against as I struggled to make sense of the difficult language, the foreign culture, and the lack of legal resources for foreigners. I often felt like an emotional piñata as my comfort zone was crossed, redefined, and crossed again. And yet somehow things sort of worked out, and I found myself starting a one-man band consulting company for the movie studios out there. And I want to share a brief anecdote so you get more color about what my life was like. One assignment required me to perform a location scout for the Netflix show Marco Polo. Now these types of roles required me to go into the most rural parts of the country, usually for months at a time alone. And the goal was to identify and negotiate for the right places to actually shoot the film, and to ingratiate myself with the locals so that the deal was honored. Well, I remember I traveled to Xinjiang province, which is so far west in China that because there's only one officially mandated time zone, the sun does not rise until 10 a.m. And I have to be honest, I became so lonely, and this loneliness was like a poverty for me. I would wake up every morning and have breakfast in this midnight landscape, and I would feel like a vagabond or an exile, feeding off of my own dreams to sustain myself in this alien landscape. And when the sun would finally rise and the mountains would explode into light in front of me, I would ache with wonder because their majesty, in my mind, almost consecrated their beauty. It was incredible. So I had mixed feelings. I then went to Shanxi province, where to this day, about 35 million Chinese people actually live in caves by choice. And I remember the local community leader refused to give me permission to shoot. And so I had to switch tactics and hustle. So I gave up my hotel and I moved into the caves with the Chinese. And I spent about 2 weeks with them, drinking at night, singing. I remember a lot of Chinese women presenting their daughters, asking me if I was interested in marrying anyone. It was so cold at night that I used to apply mud to my face to prevent it from cracking because there was no proper bed. Anyway, 2 weeks of this, and I finally got the guy to crack, and he gave me approval to shoot the film. So I then went to Zhejiang province, to a town called Dongyang, and it's very interesting because in spring festivals they have a funny tradition. They love to boil eggs in urine. Usually urine of young people, young boys, age 10 ideally. And I had to eat several of these to bond with the local. But I did it, and later that night he checked me into the hotel. Turns out this was a traditional Chinese sex hotel, and as I took a look around, I realized there were colored rib condoms in every drawer, there were lube dispensers, there were handcuffs, all sorts of paraphernalia, a beautiful leather dildo bag, and most importantly, this bizarre sign that I found. And I don't have the other photo that went with this, but there was a caption underneath that read in English and Mandarin, "Chinese women be afraid of big Western parts." So it was like astonishing for me to be in this kind of thing. And I tell you all these stories because in the space of just a few weeks, I would go up and down with all these different environments and these types of sensory overloads. And yet, despite everything, I felt very expanded as a person. I loved my time in China. I loved the people, what they taught me, the charms of the history, the country. And I started to really get work. I did these types of assignments, and I was able to get an apartment, save money. And by this time in my life, my maternal grandparents had passed away, and my uncle, who I mentioned, had no one to take care of him. So I was very proud and started to save money by setting it aside to give him a better life. Any money I didn't save went to the top line of American Airlines or Cathay Pacific as I flew to London to see Rosemary when I wasn't working. So by 2015, I really felt like I was at the top of my game. I started to work on some pretty incredible franchises. Warcraft, Star Trek, Pacific Rim, Transformers, Star Wars, Marco Polo. And if we have time in Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about that and share some funny stories with the actors on set. But we're now in 2015, and I felt I really had made an impact. I suddenly had an apartment in Los Angeles, in Century City. I started a software company that was VC-backed and had been around for a year and seemed to get past the difficult early milestones. In May of the same year, I got into the GSV, and I thought, wow, my life is really perfect. Like, how could it get any better? And then, for whatever reason, my number came up. And in the space of 3 months, I lost almost everything that mattered to me. It's still so strange, but in early May, I got a call, and the consulting company that I had always had and that I had saved money with, and I had about $80,000 or something like that saved at the time, it was guarded by a friend, a very close family friend, to prevent against fraud or theft. And I got a call telling me that all of the money had been stolen by precisely the person who was meant to protect it. And I never got any of it back. And that was meant for my uncle. And it symbolized everything I had achieved in China. And for me, it just cut me to the bone, because I started to really question my faith in entrepreneurship in China. In late May, a couple weeks later, I got a call from Rosemary, and suddenly I was fighting a war on two fronts. She was a lawyer in the United Kingdom and couldn't practice outside of her jurisdiction. And so the idea of me going to Stanford after China was not a winning play in her book. She got used to the predictability of corporate life in the city of London, and the idea of sticking with a creative guy who had a very up and down life was not going to work. And so she told me, we have to sort this out or the relationship's going to fail. So that came onto my plate. And then in early June, I got another call from the VC who had backed my software company. Turns out he had been indicted for corruption and had fled the country. Great. He never came back and is still in hiding to this day. And within 2 weeks, all of my funding was gone, and I had to let my engineering team go. And 2 or 3 weeks after that, I had to shut down the company. And just everything was going one by one. It was like the universe was telling me I needed to make a major pivot or something. So I decided to take one more big risk, and I flew on a stealth trip to the United Kingdom without telling anyone, including Rosemary. I checked into a hotel, but not before a very important stop in Hatton Gardens, which is London's jewellery district. The next morning, armed in a clean suit, which is important to me, a bottle of champagne, and a secret request for permission, I boarded the Sunrise train to Lincoln in the Eastern Midlands to Rosemary's parents' home. I remember the whole train ride up, I thought my heart was going to burst out of my chest and just break a train window. I was so nervous. I had spent the prior 12 weeks on set, in between takes, calling jewelers for the right engagement band. Figured this would be the thing she was looking for. Feeling the weight of the ring box in my pocket, I felt an incredible sense of destiny. Well, Rosemary's parents are two of the kindest people I've ever met. They're very gentle, and they sound very much like Jon Snow and the characters north of the wall. Kind of like that. And it was great, because I surprised them right as they were finishing breakfast. And of course, I pitched my case, and they gave me, with much joy, their blessing. And I remember feeling like I won the Academy Award for Awesomeness in that moment. It was fabulous. There was only one more stop to make. So I took the afternoon train, and I figured, oh, this is great. With the timing, I can be back with Rosemary in her apartment in Notting Hill by dinner time. Okay, I called ahead to her law firm, got her secretary, and I ensured that there was no important client engagements on the Monday, because I had booked 2 tickets to Stockholm for the weekend. I had rented this incredible log cabin in the countryside on a lake underneath the stars, and it was there that I intended to propose. Well, I definitely surprised her, but something was very, very wrong when I got there. The warmth that normally flows from Rosemary to me was nowhere to be found at the time. And being English and not knowing what to say or do, she made tea. And I remember she sat there for what felt like hours, like the Sphinx, with this kind of magical sadness in her eyes. And it didn't really matter what I said or did. The fissure that had been expanding in our relationship for the past 2 months had grown quietly but rapidly in an irreparable way. And all of a sudden the ground just kind of opened up beneath my feet, and I represented a path and a life she just could not share. I think that was the longest evening of my life. And the funniest part is that she never even saw the ring. When I left the flat with my luggage on the street, I remember laughing hysterically because I realized I didn't have anywhere else to go. So I ended up going to Sweden, and I felt so weird and unmoored from myself. I think all the events of the past 3 months had taken a real toll on me, but this was the equivalent of like an extinction event. I just could not process anything, and I shut down for a long time. 2 weeks later, I was in Colombia with all of you. And it's hard for me to share all these details and be vulnerable, but it's important to me that I do this because Colombia and all of you were the only blank slate in my life that had no prior association with Rosemary or film or any of the rest of it. And I couldn't help but be brought back to first impressions one more time. What was the first impression I gave to you on Colombia? According to Cyril, it was dark. And I can't blame him for thinking that. I probably came across as disturbed, a little like I do in interviews. But that said, I also thought about the first impressions that you gave to me, and that was of a gracious community, one that loved someone like me, an entrepreneur with passion, someone who was figuring it out, who took a path less traveled, one that had a lot of risk, but one that could also create a lot of interesting impacts. And throughout my time here, you've helped me rise from my ashes, and you've helped me experience joy again and again, and for that I'm forever grateful to all of you. And I want to wrap up by braiding together a few parting thoughts on what I've learned in my life. Follow your bliss. If that's entrepreneurship, please follow it with bold irreverence. But be keenly aware of the cost it has on those whom you love. Honor your friends and loved ones, but realize that they will change over time, as will you. Please don't let those changes take you by surprise. And it's not the big things in life that really matter. It's the quiet accumulation of the small stuff that makes all the difference. If you can pay attention to those small joys, the big stuff takes care of itself. I learned all of that here from you, and you helped me learn how to belong to myself. And I have one last thought. My tea group often told me that my dress and eccentric style gave me a sort of power, but at the same time had a risk because I wasn't always vulnerable. All I can say is that I hope your second first impression of me today, beyond all the eccentricity and the language and the nationalities, whatever you had in your mind when you first sat down, was of someone grateful, open, and most importantly, healed. Thank you so much for listening.
Denny, as you think about starting anew after you leave the GSB, how do you think about making first impressions this next time?
I think that I'm a package deal. And the reality is I will always be at risk of creating a slightly strange first impression based on who I am. But I have found that people who spend some time with me, and especially what I've learned at the GSB of late, they find that the weird first impression is actually kind of a fun thing that they remember well, and when they get to know the real me, beyond that if it was awkward, they really enjoy the contrast. And so I would say I need 2 takes in every scene.